Despite being written over 1,000 years ago, the story of Beowulf remains an integral part of the Western literary canon. The story of a mighty warrior standing up against the forces of superhuman evil continues to entrance audiences. However, the story of Beowulf should not be taken as simply a mere adventure story. A deeper analysis of Beowulf can reveal many things about the society in which it was written, including its system of justice and its way of viewing reality. Specifically, the Beowulf's depiction of clan feuding draws on the tradition of two distinct cultures, Germanic paganism and Christianity, both of which have very different and distinct views of violence and the metaphysical order. Beowulf uses feud culture and the concept of the Wergild to compare the random fatalistic nature of Germanic law with Christian preordained divine justice. For many early Germanic peoples, the Wergild, or the man price, was the only way of acquiring justice, even at the cost of human life. How the Wergild worked was that whenever someone was killed, even by accident, their family members were bound by honor to get revenge. They could either kill the killer in turn, or have them pay a certain sum of money based on the slain man's social status. The amount of money wasn't valuable so much for its economic value as it signified that the slain man's kinsmen had done their duty and maintained their family's honor. Now, in theory, the idea of the Wergild was supposed to prevent this type of mass bloodshed and interclan feuding. However, in practice, it didn't really work out all that well. Attempts to prevent feuds often met with catastrophic failure, as the Wergild and the blood feuds ensnared their victims in a fatalistic, never-ending cycle of violence and death. Now, this idea of fatalism was baked into the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon worldviews. The idea of fate, doom, and weird as an all-controlling force was a typical feature of Germanic religion. For example, the Norse pantheon was subject to weird in the form of Ragnarok, the day when the forces of chaos would finally overwhelm the gods. Pagan society, unlike Christian society, had no all-powerful god dictating events. Fate, as a purely natural and all-consuming impartialistic force, was inevitable. Now, the fatalistic aspects of the Wergild and the comparison with Christian society are demonstrated in Beowulf through both the battles with the monsters and with the humans. The story of Beowulf begins with a king named Hrothgar, who lives in a fabulous hall called Heorot. However, every night, his hall is terrorized by the demon Grendel, who enters his hall and slaughters his men. This continues until he is saved by a warrior named Beowulf, who wrestles Grendel without armor or weapons and kills him by ripping off his arm. Seemingly a simple adventure story. However, certain parts of the text make it clear that Hrothgar is meant to be representative of certain elements of Germanic culture, and this can be seen through the section of the story which has become known by scholars as the Finnsburg episode. Now, the oddly placed Finnsburg episode, which is a poem within a poem told by Hrothgar's Shope, which is sort of like a traveling poet, is jammed into the victory celebration after the defeat of Grendel, and has led many critics to believe the story is just a rabbit trail with little to no relevance to the main plot of Beowulf. However, when reading Beowulf as a comparison between pagan and Christian cultures, the Finnsburg episode becomes a thematically significant means of revealing the tension inherent to Hrothgar's pagan halls. The Finnsburg episode tells the tragedy of Hildebur, a Danish princess who was married to a Frisian king in order to heal the feud between their two peoples. However, the truce quickly falls apart and many great warriors on both sides are killed. The story, as told through Hildebur's eyes, is not a martial epic or a glorious tale of war. Since she has family on both the Danish and Frisian camps, the poet's audience becomes painfully aware of the family ties severed by death on both sides. Finn, the king of the Frisians, offers to pay tribute to Hengest, but in keeping with the real-life practice of the Wergild, the treaty soon fell apart as the Danes considered the blood price insufficient to satiate their desire for revenge. The Finnsburg episode should be read as part of the larger narrative arc of Beowulf. In this light, the tragedy of Hildebur's story, as told in Hrothgar's hall, becomes a suggestion that certain elements of the story are metaphorically parallel to the political, social, and psychological conditions inherent in Heorot Hall. As heavily implied at certain points throughout the Beowulf epic, Heorot Hall is doomed to be destroyed in a similar fashion. The similarities between the burning of Heorot and the Finnsburg episode show that the Beowulf poet is drawing parallels between the two stories, which is made most evident by the character of Walchtheo, Hrothgar's queen, who will suffer a fate much similar to Hildeburh's. Because the themes of blood, feud, and vengeance were so prominent in Germanic culture, the members of the poet's audience would have been instantly aware of the comparison being drawn. Walchtheo and the other women in the Beowulf text are characters charged with keeping the peace who know that peace is impossible in a world racked by constant feuding. Since the perspective of Hildeburh makes the Finnsburg episode a tragedy rather than a war epic, the fall of Hrothgar's house should be read in the same light. The destruction of Hrothgar's hall to blood feuds is meant to be read as not only tragic, but inevitable. Arthur E. Dubois notes that the Grendel attacks were not because of the success of Heorot, but because of its weakness. Hrothgar, especially when contrasted with Beowulf, is shown as an ineffective ruler whose vulnerability, caused by feuding, brings about the destruction of his house. The poet, when contrasting Hrothgar and Beowulf, makes it clear that each is supposed to be representative of a different form of rulership. Beowulf, and thus the people he rules, are portrayed as strong, while Hrothgar is weak and ineffective. The poet also makes a key distinction between the two in terms of their spirituality. From the beginning of the poem, Hrothgar is shown to be representative of the pagan tradition. Immediately after the Grendel attacks, Hrothgar quickly turns to pagan deities for protection. And given the poet's Christian sensibilities, this only makes the situation worse. However, the poet establishes a clear juxtaposition between the pagan and Christian tradition in Beowulf's character. The poet does not go as far as making Beowulf a solely Christian character. He embodies characters of both Germanic and Christian traditions. Thus, Beowulf becomes a bridge character in which the new Christian ethics are combined with historic tradition. Now, the character Beowulf's worldview is definitively Christian. Beowulf, before fighting Grendel, removes his armor and sword, choosing instead to let God decide the outcome of the battle. In contrast to the Germanic worldview, in which the outcome of the battle would be decided not by gods, but by this nebulous, impersonal weird, Beowulf chooses instead to place his trust in an intelligent, guiding entity, clearly distinguishing his worldview from that of a Germanic person. Now, Beowulf's conception of violence as it fits into the social and metaphysical order is different from a Germanic understanding of the world. Beowulf himself obviously is not opposed to the ideas of violence and feuding. From beginning to end of the text, the character is defined by his skill in battle and his martial ability. However, Beowulf's first battle with Grendel is not motivated by revenge. He is only trying to help a weakened Hrothgar. The character of Grendel, on the other hand, is centered around the idea of the blood feud. The poet writes of Grendel that he is a member of Cain's clan, whom the creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. Grendel's feud is not with Beowulf or with Hrothgar. Grendel's feud is with God. Grendel is only interested in destroying humans so that he can destroy the works of God. Thus, the idea of the feud and justice has been subsumed into a larger struggle between good and evil. But the basic idea of justice for a crime transferring through family lines still remains. Excuse me. The difference here is that instead of the fatalistic nature of Germanic law, the justice and the blood price is dictated by a divine law. So in the poet's worldview, it's possible for the feud, specifically the great feud between God and the monsters, to happen across multiple levels, both physical and supernatural. For the poet, the supernatural conflict ranks higher than the physical in terms of importance and scale. Here, the poet again compares Beowulf and Hrothgar in religious terms. Since Hrothgar is meant to be representative of pagan tradition, he is grounded solely in the material realm while being beset by spiritual forces. It is for this reason that Hrothgar and Heorot inevitably fall. Because Hrothgar does not understand the spiritual dimensions of his feud, he accidentally chooses the wrong side of the higher feud, the spiritual feud, by allying himself with the adversaries of God through his prayers to pagan deities. On the other hand, when fighting Grendel, Beowulf chooses to abandon his worldly weapons in favor of his God-given strength. Beowulf, who is aware of the spiritual implications of his battle, knows that material weapons will inevitably fail. And the poet links explicitly in the text Beowulf's reliance on God to his defeat of Grendel. However, after Beowulf slays Grendel, Heorot is attacked once again by a second monster, Grendel's mother. to defeat her, Beowulf must swim down into a cave for almost an entire day to find Grendel's mother. In this cave, he is almost killed by Grendel's mother. Almost. But he manages to defeat her with a magic sword, which is linked in the text to God's providence over Beowulf. While Beowulf's interactions with Grendel have remained consistent with the interpretation of divine guidance, some critics, like H.L. Rogers, have interpreted Beowulf's actions with Grendel's mother as divergent from this theme. But a more consistent reading of the passages surrounding Grendel's mother will indicate that Beowulf's actions remain consistent with the idea of Beowulf as a Christian knight. The concept of the Wergild is equally important to a proper understanding of Grendel's mother. Unlike Grendel, who feuded against God, Grendel's mother's quest for vengeance is directed solely at Beowulf. Her actions at Heorot are in keeping with the tradition of the blood feud and the Wergild, targeting Beowulf for killing her son. While still an agent of both physical and supernatural warfare, she has brought the conflict down to the level of a clan feud. However, there is still a divine being in control of the outcome. Before Beowulf and Hrothgar confront Grendel's mother in her lair, the poet contrasts them once again, in terms of religion. Hrothgar is shown to be weak and ineffective, while Beowulf is a strong and confident warrior. Since Beowulf's skill and martial ability is shown to be linked to a gift from God, the poet demonstrates that God maintains a divine control over the outcome of the battle. The poet demonstrates this divine control throughout the battle with Grendel's mother. Rogers is correct to an extent in claiming that Beowulf emphasizes personal glory in this battle. Here, his tendencies as a Germanic hero are being brought to the forefront. But the poet does not abandon Beowulf's Christian nature. Instead, the two natures, Christian and Germanic, are brought together in Beowulf, who acts as a bridge character between the two cultures. As Rogers points out, strength in Beowulf is a God-given attribute. For Beowulf to rely on strength as a means of defeating Grendel's mother indicates that God still has control over the battle. Thus, Beowulf's glory-seeking tendencies do not conflict with his attributes as a Christian hero. He seeks victory and glory like a Germanic hero, but with the key distinction that the outcomes of his battles are determined by God, both cosmic and personal. Such a principle naturally extends to Beowulf's battles with rival clans. The rival clans do not show up in most of the poem and exist mostly in the backdrop until Beowulf has slain a third monster, the dragon. However, as Dubois notes, the most significant element of the battle with the dragon is not Beowulf's death itself, but the references both before and after the battle to rival clans. The real tragedy of the battle with the dragon is not Beowulf's death, but the fear that his people have that, with his passing, they will be left vulnerable to attacks by rival clans. Beowulf, though, while dying, explicitly praises God for giving him the dragon's hoard and asks him to use it as a means to defend his people in the future. Beowulf's people, even after his death, have hope and are given this hope by the idea that a divine being will control their fate. Here, the poet establishes the final comparison between the Christian and Germanic ideas of violence. While death is still a daily part of life under the Christian worldview, the poet shows his belief in a God, not an impersonal weird, guiding the effects of battles and the outcomes of violence to persons and communities. Unlike the Germanic metaphysical conception of reality, where even the gods are subject to this idea of weird, and the idea of the Wergild is the only option by which peoples can check back the effects of clan violence, in Beowulf, the outcomes of battles are directly reliant upon a personal, knowable, and understandable God. And I'd like to take your questions now if you have any.